Hello folks, Scott Phillips here, and welcome to my channel. A couple of months ago, when some of us were participating in the BookTube event New Worlds November, celebrating science fiction, my personal favorite genre of reading for pleasure, I did a video about the short story Pard by F. Paul Wilson. And that came out for the first time in the December 1972 issue of Analog. Hit the newsstands a month before the cover date. So it occurred to me when I was doing that video that it was the 50th anniversary to the month of the appearance of that magazine on the racks. And that was an important issue to me personally because it was the very first issue of Analog or of any science fiction magazine that I bought myself and started reading science fiction regularly starting at that point. I had read some other science fiction before that, some classics like The Time Machine, H.G. Wells, some earlier stories that had maybe come out, some earlier Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury, things like that once in a while, but nothing regular. That was the issue that marked my first steps into collecting and reading science fiction and becoming a fan of current stories coming out back then. Well, that was the December issue, the December 72 issue. So the next issue was the January 73 issue. And it occurred to me that that was 50 years ago this month. So an important moment in my life when I was first starting to read science fiction regularly is now 50 years ago. And I had this idea. What if I go back and start reading, or in many cases rereading, the short stories, novelettes, novels that were published in the year 1973 as a 50th anniversary celebration of my own inauguration into reading science fiction. And to just kind of keep it manageable number and to kind of help to make sure that the stories that I go back and look at are particularly interesting, I'm going to focus on the stories that came out that were eventually nominated or won a Hugo or a Nebula award. And that January 1973 issue of Analog happened to have one such story. That was a short story, A Thing of Beauty, by Norman Spinrad. Now, I have to admit that I've never really followed Norman Spinrad over the years for whatever reason. So when I went back and read A Thing of Beauty, I was happy to find out that I liked it quite a bit. It has some things in it that I like that really kind of hit me close to home. One, it's set in New York City, one of my favorite places. Whenever New York City shows up in something, it already has my interest. And then the other thing is that there's one aspect, one scene that talks about something from a particular moment in art history that was a big influence on me when I was in junior high and high school, and we'll get into that. So before we do, though, let's just talk real quick a little bit about Norman Spinrad himself, and then we'll move on to the story. Norman Spinrad was born in 1940 in New York City, and these days he's 82 years old, so he is still with us. And he sold his first science fiction story to John W. Campbell for the May 1963 issue of Analog. It was called The Last of the Nominee, and was pretty much in the Campbell mold, but a couple of years later, he was already evolving into more of a new wave science fiction author. And in fact, his story, Carcinoma Angels, was included in Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions, which came out in 1967, kind of a turning point for new wave science fiction. He's probably best known for a couple of controversial novels. The first one in 1969 was Bugjack Baron, which got banned in the UK. And then in 1972, he came out with The Iron Dream, which was banned in Germany. But he's always been best known to me for having written the original series Star Trek episode The Doomsday Machine, which came out in 1967. And that one was banned nowhere. As I mentioned, A Thing of Beauty was first published in the January 1973 issue of Analog magazine, and it went on from there to be nominated for a Nebula Award for Best Short Story that year. it's set in a near future New York City. And in that future, a lot of the country has been decimated by insurrectionists of some kind. We're not told any of that backstory at all. We don't know what happened. All we know is that a lot of the things in the country from coast to coast have been damaged beyond any practical usefulness or economies of repair. So things are just kind of falling apart and are mostly abandoned. And yet, somehow in this same future, technology and commerce have just been rolling along somehow almost without a hitch. And in fact, Dun & Bradstreet is still providing financial data for businesses somehow. So an interesting future that. But it's the story of a Japanese businessman, Shigeru Ito, who comes to New York City to see if he can buy one of these damaged landmarks and transport it back to his estate in Kyoto to impress his in-laws. It's very important to him. And so he comes to meet with Mr. Harris in his New York offices to broker that kind of a deal, see what's available. And following the tradition of business in Japan in those days, he comes bearing a gift. And he's done his due diligence. He's discovered that Harris is a connoisseur and collector of Fillmore posters, rock and roll event posters from the mid-1960s. So he presents to him a perfect mint condition, the original Grateful Dead poster from 1966 for the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. And of course, Harris just melts for that and makes him realize that in this particular future, a mint condition poster like that particular poster is priceless. There's no amount of money or economic influence or power that someone should be able to buy this. So he realizes that Ito is a pretty good mark. He's got a lot of money to spend on some New York artifact or a damaged monument. So they hop into some kind of a hovercraft and take a tour of New York City to kind of show off what he might be able to sell Ito. And they look at things like the Statue of Liberty, which during the insurrection has had its head blown off. So it's standing there in the harbor, still holding the torch and everything, but just without a head. And then so he takes them then to Yankee Stadium, which Ito loves. Turns out that Ito is a huge baseball fan. And as they tour the stadium, Ito knows every square inch of the place somehow. He knows the stories of here's where Babe Ruth did that, or where Joe DiMaggio did this, or Mickey Mantle hit a home run up there. And he just knows every square inch of the place, but there's something about it that he just can't buy it. Something about baseball or something that would not go over with his in-laws or something like that. So they go to monument and landmark one after another like this, and none of them are quite right. They go to the UN, things like that. And so it looks like Ito is just not happy. And Harris is worried now because he's going to lose selling God knows how much money's worth of some kind of a landmark, and then his commission is going to be 10% of whatever that is. And he feels like he may have offended this Japanese businessman, which is never good for a deal like this. And so finally they're flying back to Harris's office and along the East River. And Ito looks down the river and he sees the Brooklyn Bridge and his eyes light up. And he's got to have that. And so Harris is thinking, am I actually going to wind up selling the Brooklyn Bridge to this guy? It's the old joke. And so he brokers that deal, and Ito is very happy, and things just progress from there. And the story has a pretty funny ending finally at the end. But it was really a pretty jolly story, and I was chuckling quite a bit through the whole thing, and it's a pretty good satire. But let's talk about that Fillmore poster, because that's the thing I mentioned earlier that really hit me close to home personally. I was just in the 7th grade at the time I became aware of that style, and was a huge influence on my own personal development as a graphic designer. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I was copying that style and loved all those swirly types of letterings and things. Here, let me put it up on the screen here so we can talk about it. This is the original Grateful Dead poster from 1966 that was designed by Wes Wilson for the Fillmore Auditorium in San Francisco. And he designed and hand drew, pen and ink, this entire poster and all these kinds of posters that he did, except for the photo, which was taken by Herb Green, who took almost all of the photos for Fillmore posters back in those days. But this is the poster that is mentioned in the story by Norman Spinrad here, and as it's described in the story, that by the time of the story, this poster was super rare and not available for any kind of sheer purchasing power, so basically priceless. Back in the early 1960s, all-night-long dance parties and discotheques were starting to become the thing, and Bill Graham in San Francisco wanted to have these kinds of dance parties at the Fillmore Auditorium. And his idea was to book live music for them, fledgling bands back in the time, like the Grateful Dead, like Jefferson Airplane, Mothers of Invention, the Yardbirds, groups like that. And he would often have them playing on the same night, one band after another. And of course, he needed posters then to promote these kinds of events. And in those days, event posters weren't really much other than a pretty basic fare. Like if you think of maybe an old boxing poster, for instance, that just has big block letters that announces the name of the event and then the date and the time and the venue, maybe a big square block photo of whatever the event is about, that kind of a thing. But Bill Graham had Wes Wilson working for him, and this was at the beginning of the era of psychedelic experiences, and in San Francisco was ground zero for the Haight-Ashbury counterculture. And Wilson wanted to be a little more expressive, so he started to kind of play around with some things, and Bill Graham said, yeah, go for it. And that's really what kind of got started. It was really Wes Wilson was the pioneer here. There are a few other artists that worked with him, but none really as innovative or as influential as Wilson became. And so let's take a look at just a handful of some of his work so you can kind of get a sense of it, and you'll probably recognize a lot of this stuff right away. Wes Wilson was born in 1937, so that makes him 85 years old today. He's still with us, as well as Norman Spinrad, so that's great. And he was really inspired a lot by artists like Toulouse-Lautrec and his Moulin Rouge posters from way back in the day, and the Art Nouveau artists like Alphonse Mucha, for instance. You can really see it in a lot of his work here. I blew up this one poster on the far left here because it's one of Wilson's most iconic posters. It's generally called the Association poster, but he was picking up some tips from the Impressionists here by using those competing reds and greens next to each other that really makes the eye just kind of vibrate. It's hard to read, but it's so captivating, it draws you in. All these organic flames here are actually letter forms that force you to get pulled in and read the names of the acts and the times and places and all that. Really a compelling poster and groundbreaking for its day. The little yellow or orange Batman poster there was a little bit earlier, and that was from May of 1966. It was in January of 66 that the Batman TV show first came out and was just becoming a huge pop culture kind of a campy show that everyone was talking about, so he was leveraging that a little bit. Some of the other ones are a little bit later, but most of these are all from 1966. And you can really see the Mucha influence here. Here's more of that organic psychedelic lettering in a lot of these here. There's that one gray shot in the bottom center there. That's Big Mama Thornton there, also taken by Herb Green, who photographed most of the images that were used in all of these posters. And speaking of influences, although I did not know his name at the time or know the origins of this type of art movement then at all, but the name Wes Wilson was a huge influence on little Scotty Phillips lying on the living room floor with his set of speedball pens and bottle of India ink, trying not to spill it on the carpet. But speaking of artwork, let's talk about the actual illustration that was created specifically for A Thing of Beauty in this issue of Analog magazine. This is the title page for A Thing of Beauty, drawn by the great Frank Kelly Freas. And it's a representation of things in the story rather than a literal depiction. But we see Shibaro Ito here standing and contemplating the remnants of the Statue of Liberty and kind of imagining it maybe in how it might look in his garden back in Kyoto, because we can see some sort of Japanese components down around the base of the statue there. But it's a really nice composition. I like the way the torch breaks up the type of the title there, and it really draws you into the text of the story on the next page. Now, Kelly Freas is another one of these artists that is just so influential and significant in the illustration of science fiction in general that he's going to deserve his own video just for himself at some point. But we can't mention his name without at least touching on just a little bit about him and a couple of examples of what makes him so important. Frank Kelly Freas, or as he was generally known as just Kelly Freas, was born in 1922, and he passed away on January 2nd, 2005, which is just yesterday would have been the anniversary of his death. That was a sad day in my memory when I heard of his passing, because he was a huge name and a favorite science fiction illustrator for me ever since I first picked up that very first issue that I mentioned earlier, the December 72 issue of Analog magazine. He did a great cover on that one, and still that cover is one of my very favorites. But he was born in Hornell, New York, and during his career he won no less than 11 Hugo Awards for the best artist, as well as several other professional awards over the years. And then before wrapping things up here, let's just take a really quick look at a small handful of some of the milestones of his more significant covers here, just to get a sense of his style if you don't already know it already. And then at some point down the line, like I say, I'm going to do a dedicated video just on him and his artwork. Starting on the far left is Frank Kelly Freas' very first cover ever for the November 1950 cover of Weird Tales magazine. And then the next one over is another iconic piece of art by Mr. Freas, and that was 1952's fix-up novel by Clifford D. Simak, City. A very famous cover there. And probably the most famous of all is the third image here, also very iconic, from the November 53 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, which was later on adapted by Kelly Freas himself for the Queen album News of the World in 1977. And then finally, here is his first Mad Magazine cover. He did a lot of those covers as well, and this one is from February 1957. Mad Magazine being another huge influence in the development of little Scotty Phillips. So, if you've never read Norman Spinrad's A Thing of Beauty ever before, and this video has maybe somehow whetted your appetite to do so, and you don't have access to that original Analog magazine, it has been collected in some anthologies over the years, and I'll recommend just a couple here, both from 1974, the first being Best Science Fiction Stories of the Year, edited by Lester Del Rey, with a great Dean Ellis cover, another depiction of the ruins of the Statue of Liberty. And then 2020 Vision, edited by Jerry Purnell, with a great John Berkey cover of one of his fantastic spaceships. And there you have it, folks. So I hope you enjoyed this little walk down memory lane here, celebrating the 50th anniversary of my personal adventures through reading and collecting science fiction with award winners and nominees from the year 1973. And that's it. So I'll let you go now and get back to reading whatever you're up to. And until next time, thanks a lot.